Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Stoic answers to moral dilemmas and some classic controversial thought experiments. So it should be a fun one.
Yeah, this was one I wanted to do. I'm excited for it. So, I'm sure most people listening to this podcast have experienced or heard some of these kind of thought experiments or moral dilemmas, like the trolley problem. They're really popular in undergrad philosophy courses. There's something that I really enjoyed, and philosophy in general really loves this idea of like playing with intuition, putting really evocative situations in front of you and asking you what your intuition might be or what the right thing to do is. And I think those are really good ways of pulling out the implications of ethical theories or seeing how they would work in practice. I think there are also fun ways to get at what you believe with really concrete examples or your understanding of a current theory and how it would, how it would play out in that scenario. So we're going to do that today with Stoicism. Going to put our Stoic hats on and talk about how, at least how, maybe we'll disagree, Caleb, but how we think Stoics would answer these questions. I think it's going to be really fun. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. I think these are fun questions, but also get at sort of these important moral issues, questions of moral value. And I think both the questions themselves and how you approach them can be very revealing. So it should be fun to go along with these and, think through what your own answers are, whether you think we represent the Stoics accurately or not. And, email us with any disagreements or questions here. So, but yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, I guess that's the right way to. Well, you just hit on something for those listening, playing along at home. I guess there's two separate questions. There's like what the Stoics think. Did we get that right? And then what you think. And maybe there will be some cases where there's a difference between what you think and what the Stoics think, and that can kind of maybe reveal some interesting contrasts of where where you're fully Stoic or where you're not. Cool. So to kick things off, we'll start with probably the most famous one, the most memed in the current internet era, at least, which is the trolley problem. Um, so this presents a scenario where a runaway trolley or train is headed down the tracks, and there's some number of people tied down to the tracks, is how it was first told to me. In this example, I pulled as 5 people, and you have the option to pull a lever. Maybe you're watching the train go, maybe you're on the train, and if you pull the lever, you divert the trolley onto another track where there's only one person present. So the the way the thought experiment is set up, at least in, and I guess the important piece there is that you've had no involvement. You've kind of just found yourself in this situation. You
Mm-hmm.
didn't tie anybody down to the track. Nobody deserves to be there. Everybody's kind of like morally equivalent. And when I learned this in undergrad, it's really used as this way of contrasting utilitarianism versus deontology. And utilitarianism is this kind of, you determine the morality through this calculus of, well, 5 people's lives is better than one person's life. So clearly I pull the lever and I kill the one person. And then the deontologist view is more rule based. So maybe there might be a rule like you cannot murder. And so if you find yourself in this situation, pulling the lever is this equivalent of actually murdering this person. You're intervening in a way that causes that person to die. And so maybe the deontologist might say, well, it's not appropriate to murder one person to save 5 lives. And then there's these kind of more progressive examples of this thought experiment. So if somebody does the utilitarian answer and says, "Oh, I would pull the lever, I would kill the one person to save 5 lives," you might follow up and say, "Well, if you were this doctor, if you were a doctor, would you kidnap and harvest the organs of one person if it could save 5 people?" And people usually have this like averse reaction to that. And so it's this fun way of pulling out kind of, you know, I guess it's consequences versus actions, right? And what has more of a role to play. Any other setup in for the trolley problem before we get into the Stoic response?
Yeah, I think that's a fine setup. Maybe perhaps another way to frame it is, consequences versus actions. There's also the question, is there any moral significance to the distinction between killing and letting die? is something people
Mm.
also talk about. So if you just let the trolley run its course and hits the five, in a sense, you're not killing anyone. You're just letting five die. Whereas if you hit the lever, then you're making an intentional decision to kill another person. And there's that another way to frame it is is that a significant distinction at all? Is that something that matters?
Hmm. He had a good point. So for me, I think this is a hard one. I was trying to think about this a little beforehand, but not too much, so that we could chat through it. I think this so Stoics, their ethics, I think this is going to come up time and time again. Their ethics is kind of really embedded in the context and the scenario. It's like really hard. There's not going to be many situations where the Stoic is able to make a decision without any context and that be really clear. Like a lot of Stoic ethics comes down. I think there's this kind of rule of don't do anything irrational, don't do anything based on an untrue belief. But then a lot of Stoic ethics is going to come down to your roles, your relationships. Are you the driver who's like swore this oath of minimizing harm? Do you have some sort of relationship to the people on the tracks? And this is something that when people first hear this problem, they always try to throw in those examples, and philosophers are like, no, no, don't think about those examples. We're just trying to limit it. But I think the Stoics is going to be one of the schools that's going to try to do it. That being said, if we limit it just the situation, I think the Stoics are going to probably err on the side of pulling the lever. I think they're going to err on the side of killing the one and saving the five, because I think that, I mean, many of the ways people ground the issue with pulling the lever of like, oh, I would feel really bad about killing that one person, or
Mm-hmm.
I would feel like it was my fault, or, um, you know, some I was told not to kill as a child, and that's some sort of rule that I've just followed without reflection. I think a lot of the justifications for not pulling the lever, the Stoics are not going to agree with. So without additional information, saving five lives is more important than saving one. And so they're going to err on the side of pulling the lever if you have these kind of morally equivalent people on the track. That's my swing at it. What do you think?
Yeah, it's this one's a hard one. So, and as you say, there's always that instinct to sort of fight the hypothetical, and I think that it can be a justified instinct, and ask these questions about what's really going on. Is there some other option? Who are the people involved? How they end up on the tracks? Why are things set up this way and such? But
Yeah.
but so if you, I think those are important, and I think it's a totally legitimate move for Stoics to attack this form of reasoning, perhaps maybe even think like this isn't the right way to do ethics, think through these different thought experiments. But that being said, setting that concern aside and just thinking through, okay, what a Stoic, what's the Stoic, to the extent that we can hold everything constant, what's the actual answer? Do you pull the lever or not? What's the best stab? My sense is, and this is not a very fun answer, I'll have more fun, controversial answers later, but is that there's not a strong Stoic prescription either way. I could see Stoics erring on the heuristic of, in general, it's better to save more people than not. But I could also see them thinking, well, an essential part of justice is not killing people, and it's not just a matter of how you feel, but it's having that strong disposition not to be involved in causing other people's death. And I do think that Stoics would sort of hold that there is some distinction between killing people and letting them die. That just says different facts about the people involved. Both, it's a different thing to be a killer and to let someone die. I think those are
Mhm.
there are different dispositions involved in those kind of actions or omissions. So I think that's might be a reasonable take. And as you say, as soon as you say you should pull the lever, then there are these other questions about different scenarios that might be more troubling, more counterintuitive for people.
Yeah, so a bit of I mean, we might be stuck here with that in between. I'm taking the controversial, I'm going to say like 60-40 lever pulling over here. You're more in the 50-50 side. I think I do like your point. I mean, there's something there. A big part of Stoicism is accepting fate. So is this idea of like, hey, they just had they found themselves tied to the tracks. what can you do? And is there some sort of metaphor there about like not accepting, you know, you're not really amorphating very well if you're pulling the lever, but that's the kind of like lazy man argument
Yeah, I think so.
that the Stoics object to. So, okay, we disagree on this one. I'm going a bit to the lever side. You're 50-50 in the middle. But overall, as you said, not really the way the Stoics do their ethics, really a bit of a difficult one to do without further context.
Yeah, perhaps another way to add some more context would be, so if you think about the physician example, where I think the best way to set it up is you've got 6 people at a hospital, none of them are there by choice. It's not their fault or anything of this sort. And it just so happens that you can harvest the organs of 5 to save the one. Or sorry, other way around. You can harvest the organs of 1 to save the 5. And there, I think Stoics have a good response related to people's roles, right? It's not the role of a physician to be
Yeah.
making that sort of decision. And it would harm the institution of a hospital if people arrived at the hospital and thought there was some chance that they might be sacrificed for the collective, essentially. So I wonder if the argument against your view, Michael, as well, the relevant roles here are you're a citizen, and maybe the citizens.
You're building that into this, right? Where there's no,
Yeah, that's true.
there's no, I didn't say anything about
Yeah, you could be in a
citizenship.
foreign country. You could be. Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, this is sort of interesting. Well, you're in some kind of community, so I guess the question is, does that community have a norm around this? And
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
yeah, so generally, I don't think we expect people to be making these kinds of decisions unless they might be, as you said, the train conductor or an engineer or somehow involved in uh, enforcing justice or something like this at the broader level. So, and then it's sort of a question of, what's the makeup of the community, and do you expect people
Yeah.
uh, to pull the lever in these kinds of situations?
I mean, we could do a whole trolley problem episode, but I mean, I think the example, I guess the counter argument here, which relates to another thought experiment I had, um, is, does there kind of hit a point of absurdity though, where pulling the lever, regardless of community, like you're trying to break the hypothetical and you're saying, look, we make appeals to the, what you do is you ask what community you're a part of. You can't make this question. It's 50-50. You can't answer this question and avoid. You have to ask, what are the social norms of the people you're around and your community? And I'm not sure if that's the case. I don't know if we need to appeal to that. There, if there's 1,000 people on the track, 10,000 people on the track, 1,000,000 people on the track, there almost hits a point of absurdity.
Mm-hmm.
The same way you can make the pulling the lever example absurd by making it seem very cruel as the doctor to pick somebody and harvest their organs. Um, you can make the not pulling the lever seem absurd by kind of upping the odds there too. So I do think there is some weight. There's just some weight to death um, outside of cultural norms. It's at least dispreferred.
Yeah.
But cool. I think we can spend the whole time on this one.
No, I
And
think, yeah. Before we move on, I think that's the right move. The right move for the Stoic defense of pooling, as it were, is that
team pull.
yeah, at some point it seems obvious that you should pull the lever if there are enough people involved. So then the question is, like, why would a Stoic value killing as such when there are just simply more lives at stake? And then the Stoic, I suppose, the further rejoinder to that might be to take the hard line, which some people do. You just shouldn't be involved in killing at all, or think, well, these situations with larger numbers are really qualitatively different in some way. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's that one.
Well, I want to jump ahead to this related one, which is the ticking time bomb scenario. I remember doing this one in second year ethics. These are really fun to do in rooms full of people, some that are interested in philosophy and some that aren't, and some that are, have varying different feelings about it. But the ticking time bomb scenario, so it's a situation where a terrorist, some sort of bad person has planted a bomb that's about to explode, and you have the ability to torture the suspect to get information that could save lives. You can The question is, should you torture the terrorist to find out where the bomb is? And you can play the lever, like, are you 100% certain they know where it is? Are you mostly certain they know where it is? You can kind of play with some of these scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess my answer to this one is that yes, the Stoic would say yes, it's absolutely morally permissible to torture to get information that saves lives. And I think because this scenario builds in the stuff that you were just talking about, it builds in cultural context, right? You've got somebody that is, I think a terrorist is like a politically loaded term, but somebody who's in opposition to your community. You're a member of that community, and I think it's not permissible in all scenarios, and there becomes like a question of scale, right? But absolutely, it's permitted in the higher extremes. The real kind of 10,000 people, lives at stake situations, without a doubt. And that's the way that I view the Stoic response, because it builds in that cultural responsibility and it makes clear who that other person is somebody, um, that's trying to do something unjust or harmful. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is somewhere where I agree. I agree with what you just said, and somewhere this perhaps a more controversial answer from the Stoics, perhaps. I mean, the historical record, I don't see anywhere where they made a strong objection to torture, which some modern people do. I don't see that the ancient Stoics making those sorts of arguments, saying that torture is never morally permissible. So it doesn't seem like there's this hard line. And then the question, the relevant question is this, if this person is in fact a terrorist, it's a different setup from the trolley problem. They're not innocent, and the scale is so much larger, such that torturing would be permissible. I think, of course, this is another one where people want to challenge the hypothetical, and I think these are important questions, which is torture actually effective? And I know people argue that, and then you can maybe get into a little bit of a thornier questions where say this person's a suspect, but how much confidence do you have that they are in fact involved in the plot, and that those situations might be sticky. But when you get into cases where you're higher confidence that they're involved in the plot and that torture is going to be effective, which at some level I think it must be, it would be very surprising to me if it was never effective, or you can never expect it to be effective. I think the Stoic would endorse effective torture here in order to prevent a very tragic event.
Yep. So far, agnostic about trolleys, very pro torture is where we've landed after the first two. But yeah, no, I think it's just a kind of pragmatic, like a kind of pragmatism when it comes to protecting your family or your community. And as you said, that can be pragmatically, it can be not pragmatic at a certain scale of, just repeating what you said, a certain scale of not being sure about its effectiveness. If 1 in 10,000 people knew where this bomb was and you went and tortured all 10,000 people, right? Like there can become this point of it not being pragmatic, but there's no hard and fast rule here, um, which the ethical dilemma is trying to set up. It's trying to say, well, it's almost like a counter argument for people who are like, torture is never permitted. Are you willing to bite the bullet? And then the Stoics like, well, no, I would not bite the bullet on that, because I think there are situations where it's permitted, such as this one. It's not a kind of hard and fast rule, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, stepping back from the hypothetical some, the real question is sort of like, how can you extract, if you ever find yourself in one of these situations, I suppose, how can you extract the relevant information? And perhaps torture isn't the right way to go about it, especially for all people. People have different tolerances to pain and such. They might have value different. There might be different keys to unlock the needed information for people. So there's going to be a skill at this kind of information extraction that is important to develop. And there's certainly going to be a sense in which torture is not ideal. I think, just as people think about different conditions or principles for a just war, there are going to be ideas about, is this really necessary? could you have gotten the information in a way that didn't cause as much suffering? And of course, the Stoic is going to say, yes, you should aim to reduce suffering where you can, and it's not going to be the ideal route if there was something much better. And
Yeah. Your job is to get the information. Your job isn't to like punish this person or make them hurt or anything like that. And so if there's a better way to get the information, not only should you choose that morally, I guess, but also pragmatically, you should go about the better way to get the information.
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Um, so in agreement there. Next one is the happiness machine. Um, So this is another one, another famous one. This is a machine that can provide you with unlimited pleasure and happiness by simulating perfect experiences like fulfilling desires or achieving goals while you're in a deep, blissful state of unconsciousness. The machine would ensure you feel like you're living your best possible life, experiencing everything you want, but all of it would be artificial. So this is like the person who wants to get plugged back into the matrix. You know, your body is just sitting somewhere, but you're experiencing all of these things, and you feel wow, you feel like everything's great, but in reality, these are simulations. So the question is, do you plug in? You why or why not? I think this is an unambiguous no for the Stoics. The Stoic guiding principle, if anything, is truth and living in accordance with nature. And I think this is neither truthful nor in accordance with our nature. It's not actual excellence or virtue. If you feel it through mental stimulation, you're not actually fulfilling your function or your nature. Um, you are just feeling like you're doing that, which it's ultimately a hedonistic choice. It feels good, but you're not actually achieving kind of your ethical ends or potential. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an easy one. Don't plug in. Perhaps more challenging for other philosophies, but I suppose if you want to extend it, or some questions for the Stoics would be: are there other things like the happiness machine or like the experience machine that we experience, consume, or plug into throughout our lives that might fulfill almost a similar role, be simulations uh, of something instead of the real thing itself? So I think that's sort of the Stoic challenge, really, getting to more of a practical point and moving away from the philosophical one, where I think the philosophical one is certainly don't plug in. And then perhaps there's more of a challenge around practical questions like, okay, to what extent is just consuming different forms of media plugging in, or
Mhm.
having personal narratives about your life that maybe don't map it into reality? That's sort of the Stoic challenge.
Or it makes me think of the Epicurean idea that mental pleasure is better than physical pleasure, and that you can get a lot of mental pleasure from your memories. Like you can just sit around thinking about times you had fun in the past. And I mean, I think there's that question for the Epicureans about would they plug in, but then there's also this picture, if they say no, that it seems like they're almost like building up this storehouse of good memories and then just kind of sitting around. I guess, the same question you had about media or stories. I also think this idea of like nostalgia or any
Yeah.
sort of time where we're tapping back into we're doing things that make us feel mentally comfortable and happy at the expense of truth or the expense of personal excellence is yeah, it's dangerous if not actively harmful.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think for the Stoics might say such a thing is an indifferent, and perhaps with this nostalgia case in particular, I can think of examples of people who recover the past and keep ideas or events alive in a good way, but you can also think of people who are too nostalgic and end up living in the past and missing the present.
Hmm.
So I think that's a great example.
Cool. Okay, so another easy one. This is the utility monster. I think it's kind of a criticism of utilitarianism, but I think it's worth talking about. So the utility monster is a hypothetical entity that requires an enormous amount of resources to satisfy its desires, even if it means satisfying the well-being of many others. Question is, should you feed the utility monster which feels the most joy at the expense of others? So, some person or group of people that feel incredibly, incredibly happy, Do you have an ethical obligation basically to maximize their happiness at the expense of others? This is a common objection to utilitarianism, which says the goal of life is the maximization of happiness in other people, or like in aggregate, yourself being one of many. Um, for me, the answer is obviously no. You've got no responsibility to feed the utility monster. You've got no responsibility to make other people feel good for the sake of them feeling good. You've got a responsibility to do the right thing, which can often have the positive side effect of making people feel good. But the Stoic is just never really aiming at pleasure. And so it's not stuck in these difficult choices about, oh, if I make fun of this one, if I make fun of this one kid, everybody else in class is going to laugh. And, what's the math on that? Is everybody's
Yeah.
laughter more happiness than the one bullied guy? It's like these are never problems for the Stoics in the way they are for the utilitarians. So it's like, um, it seems to me the answer, yeah, is a no.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another easy one for the Stoics. Say no to utility monster. And you can't really think
So,
of the parallel for Stoics or other virtue ethics, where it's like, what would that look like for the virtue ethicist? Having some being where you're trying to maximize their virtue at the expense of others. That doesn't really work. And
I mean,
uh,
it would be something like, I mean, it would be the inverse. It would be like somebody who's like not willing to lie. It would almost be like the things the Stoics bite. Well, what if a emperor asks you to lie, and if not, he's going to cut off your head, right? Like, are you still going to maximize virtue in that situation? And the Stoic is just like, yes, yes, I would. It's his job to compel me, and it's my job, to not be compelled. I think that's almost the reverse. Is
yeah,
you
you're
put up
right.
a situation where virtue seems ridiculous compared to all these indifference, and the Stoics are just going to say like, too bad. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, this is not the utility monster. What's the right phrase there? I don't know.
The virtue monster, the Stoic, right? The person who values virtue over anything else. Um, cool. So I'm going to keep running through these. I'm enjoying this. Maybe go to one that's a little bit harder. And this is the Euthyphro Dilemma. Not really a moral dilemma, more of kind of like maybe it's a maybe it's a moral dilemma, maybe like an axiology, like where value comes from. But this is a famous one from Plato. I think we've talked about this before in the podcast. And the question is basically, are actions good because God commands them, or does God command them because they are good? So, in other words, does God create value or discover value? And if they create value, could they have chosen something else to be good? If they discover value, is God really that important to morality? Um, and so the question is, does God create or discover value? What do you think about this? How would a Stoic answer this Platonic puzzle?
Yeah. So I think just to frame it, perhaps for Stoics, if you wanted to make it more of a live question for Stoics, Stoics think the way to live is according to nature, and then you might ask, well, is something good because it's in accordance with nature, or does nature happen to line up with what is good? And then you have some independent idea of goodness that perhaps is divorced from nature. I think that's one way to make the challenge a little more pointed for Stoics. What do you think about that kind of
Well, I think it's
move?
a good way of putting it. Like, because the Stoics claim that the universe is providential, right? Which it claims that the universe is unfolding in the best possible way. So the way to question is like, is the universe unfolding in the best possible way because it's aiming at some sort of target that is good outside of the universe, or that the universe recognizes in some way and aims towards? Or is the universe unfolding the best possible way almost like a descriptive claim? Because whatever way the universe unfolds becomes good because it is nature. And it's just your job to kind of love your fate as it occurs. That was less
Mhm.
clear than the way you put it. But yeah, I think it's like you want to live in accordance with nature. Is nature on to the good? Is nature like intelligent, perceiving the good and pursuing it and matching it? Or is it more of a descriptive claim where like, what is natural is good?
you have the sort of the question, sometimes philosophers will talk about metaethics. So it's sort of a metaethical question about the nature of the good and the metaphysics of nature, as it were. But to get more applied, some Stoics, like Musonius Rufus, in particular, has a number of examples where he'll argue something is, you ought to choose something because it is natural. It is natural to have a particular kind of diet, beard, life, what have you. And of course, you can question whether he's properly identified what is natural. But there's also the move many philosophers have made throughout history, which is just that if something's natural, if it's in accordance with nature, who cares? Why think that's good at all? And why reason that way to begin with? So that's another way to make the sort of map up the questions about the nature of ethics, goodness, nature, and such to these applied questions
Mm-hmm.
about what's good or about what one ought to do.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, but and so which way are you landing on the question?
Well, I think so. I think what the Stoic needs to do is sort of go between. So they've got to. This is sort of a dilemma, and I think they need to say it's a kind of a false dilemma or something of this sort, where they identify. It's not exactly identifying the good with nature, but well, I suppose just to make the dilemma a little clearer, like you don't want to make. I don't think the Stoic wants to say good is sort of independent of nature. I think that's too Platonic. The Stoics were not Platonists, uh, though sometimes some might talk like that. Um, but they also don't want to say nature is arbitrary. In the same sense that God could say that murder is morally permissible, therefore it becomes morally permissible. If nature had turned out such that murder was natural, would that make it
Mm-hmm.
permissible? I think the Stoics and also theists, people believe in God, would need to say, that sort of situation doesn't make sense because God is identified with goodness. Nature grounds goodness and it cannot be any other way. That world where nature promotes vice doesn't make any sense. That's not a very clear route, perhaps, but I think nature, what is God for the Stoics? It's this form of reason, provides providence, provides structure to the world. And part of that structure is what we believe is good, beautiful, and true and such. And it can't turn out. It's not independent from the way things are, but it also isn't arbitrary. So that's sort of the line I think they need to walk.
Yeah. I was trying to, so a couple things I was thinking while you were talking. One is like, this is not a moral dilemma, and the other, it's not similar to the other ones because the other ones were, this has happened. Do you do A or B? This is Plato constructing a dichotomy, and so it is a viable play for the Stoics to say that's a false dichotomy. Those don't have to be the only two choices. In the same way, it's not a fair play to say with the pulling the lever, the trolley problem. It's just like, well, just answer the question, right?
Mhm.
So that's what you're saying the play is, which I agree with. And then they've got to kind of sketch this middle path between these two. And I was trying to think of an example. And is this fair? Um, does fire discover heat, or does fire create heat? And if fire created heat, couldn't it create water instead? And then you'd have to call water heat. It almost becomes nonsensical. I don't know if that was a first try, but there's something to be said about it doesn't have to be creation or discovery, or maybe the answer is something like if it is creation, there's like almost an essentialness to the goodness of the creation in a way that it's not as if it would have been impossible for God to create otherwise or to be otherwise.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, maybe this is pushing my metaphysics a bit far, but I think you almost have to do something like that. Maybe you pick the God creates value line, but you recontextualize it to say, it creates it almost eminently. It doesn't like it doesn't decide from a list of things that it could have decided differently.
Yeah, it's not. sort of arbitrary creation out of a set of options. It's more
Yeah,
uh, God constitutes this thing or
that's
grounds this kind of
that's what I
thing
was
would
trying
be
to say. Yeah.
the sort of the other philosophical metaphors. Perhaps the Stoics also make similar, might point to mathematics in a similar way. Could things have turned out such that 2 + 2 = 5? No, necessarily 2 + 2 = 4. And that's just part of the structure of things. And goodness perhaps has a similar shape.
Hey, well, Plato's got those tough ones, but I think that's where. So I guess there's like the truth of the matter, and then it's like where the Stoics would land. I think you've described that well. I think that's how the Stoics would try to respond to this. Is try to say there's some sort of like logical necessity to this, that makes it like different from this kind of arbitrary selection from options.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that was a hard one for us. Let's take another one on.
Okay. So another one here is the sinking ship. So the dilemma involves a ship that is sinking. There's only enough room on a lifeboat for two people, but there are three people on board. How do you choose who to sacrifice? What are the factors that matter most here? So not so much a dilemma maybe as like a creative problem. So when you've got three people and you can only save two, by what criteria do you make that decision? Um, yeah, do you want to take a first step?
Yeah. So are you? I assume you're one of the people in this
Yeah,
situation.
you're one of the people.
Yeah. So I think a few things that would be relevant here for the Stoics would be, of course, we've mentioned this before, but roles. You have this idea of a captain. A captain goes down with the ship and such, and other ideas like women and children first. That's, I think, perhaps a more controversial one. Family ties matter a lot. And I think those would be the kind of things that a Stoic would bring to bear to this kinds of question. Perhaps age, uh, and then of course practical ones where, if there's no point in someone not going down with the ship if, say, they're not going to be able to. You can't expect them to survive on a lifeboat. So I think those would be the sort of situations at play. What do you think?
Yeah, those agree to me. I agree with those. I think another thing that I think about is like this kind of discipline of ascent, and a large part of Stoicism is like understanding how to die well. And I don't think you need to. That means being like self-sacrificial unnecessarily, but I think it means how would you act if you were not afraid of death would be like one of the governing things. So you'd have these considerations, but the considerations would almost be the same as if you weren't one of the three, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the considerations, you would need to treat yourself objectively, and that means both surviving if it's right for you to survive and dying if it's right for you to die. I guess it becomes more maybe more controversial if it's like what if it's you and your child and another adult you can't trust. Like do you have some sort of reason to band together against the third person if there's like family involved or something? I'm not sure, but I think that would be the key is like using the considerations you said and then also applying those considerations objectively to yourself and not letting your fear of death uh, make everybody just default to, well, I should be one of the two. Who's the other person going
Mm-hmm.
to be?
Yeah, the fear. That's a great way to put it. That's a good way to put it. And I think the problem does become harder where you have, say, you have a family tie or some other reason to survive, but no one wants to go down with the ship. So then you have, I think, harder questions around, okay, do you use violence to survive? And in some cases, I think the Stoic answer just must be yes. But I'm sure there are harder questions where it's not your child and someone you can't trust, but it's you, your child, and someone else's child who you've made promises to look after in that case.
Hmm.
And maybe you've also made promises to your child to take care of them. So I think that's a sort of case that's going to be challenging, where you're going to be torn in different directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, there's no right answer to this, I don't think, because we didn't give like a set of people, but so it's like, don't let false judgments or passions around fear of death distort your thinking. And then there comes down and then I think the considerations you raised on roles. The Stoics, certainly in their time, I think would have those more traditional norms of women and children, or prioritizing some groups over others, and then maybe, as you said, kind of promises or obligations you've made to some people over others. Anything else to add on this one?
No, that's a hard one. I think those are some of the relevant considerations. Those are definitely some of the relevant considerations, and I am stuck with that. I think that phrase it's a useful framing. How would you act if you weren't afraid of death? Is a useful framing, and I think I could check on perhaps rationalizing reasons why you ought to survive instead of
Mm-hmm.
others.
It's
So
very tempting.
yeah, that's a good move.
Cool. So next one is the prisoner's dilemma. Not really, like, again, maybe pushing the definition of moral dilemma here, but I think these are like interesting applied questions. So many people probably already heard of this. This is the idea that two prisoners are arrested for a crime and held in separate cells, unable to communicate. They're each offered a deal. If one confesses and betrays the other, they go free, while the other receives a long sentence. If both remain silent, they receive shorter sentences. If both confess, they receive a moderate sentence. What should you do? Confess or betray? And there's this game theory idea, and there's this you're in this position of being, I guess, passive or aggressive. And if you're aggressive, you basically lock yourself into a good or moderate scenario. If you're passive, you lock it into good for both of you. If you don't betray, it's either good for both of you, shorter sentence, or um, bad, like really bad for you because the other person sold you out. So it's kind of this idea. I think it's this question of like, do you go on the offense, or I don't know if it's defense, but do you not go on the offense? It's kind of the question in this situation. I think the Stoic doesn't betray. I think this is a good example of what Epictetus does talks about with the emperor who tries to convince the politician to, vote his way instead of honestly. It's to say, it's not your responsibility to try to game theory play the decisions of other people and do this kind of cost benefit analysis based on their vice or virtue. It's, you pick the right decision in a vacuum, and you understand that decision comes with a bad consequence, but yeah, that could come with a bad consequence, but you're okay with that. It's part of the, you know, sometimes virtue has consequences.
Mm-hmm.
That's my swing at it. But what do you think?
I think I generally agree, but would say that I don't think you make your decision in a vacuum here, because to me it's a question about cooperation. And one way of framing this is if you both cooperate, if you both confess, and then you'll
Well, you're cooperating if you in the way. I mean, there's different ways of doing this. In the way I wrote it, you're cooperating by both remaining silent.
yeah, gotcha.
If you both agree not to cooperate, then you get like a medium term sentence. The worst sentence is when only one person confesses and the other person doesn't. Then the person who doesn't confess in that situation,
Yeah,
it's really like you cooperate. I use the idea of like aggressive versus passive, but it's really like a cooperate versus try to screw the other person, and cooperating makes you vulnerable to them trying to screw you. Is the setup.
yeah, that's right. So I suppose you cooperate, and that involves typically going to involve remaining silent here and being open to the other person perhaps betraying you in this case. So I think that's generally going to be the Stoic answer. That being said, there might be cases where this is fighting the hypothetical a little bit, of course, but if you're involved in breaking an unjust law, perhaps you confess that you in fact did it as a matter of protest, right? In many cases of people historically protesting injustice and then sort of going through with the legal process regardless, as a symbolic act. I think that can be politically powerful. But you'd only do that, and this is why I'd say I'd question thinking of making the decision in a vacuum if you knew the other person would also confess, because you don't want to be the person who basically confesses and the other person remains silent and then you hose them. or,
So another way of putting that is like the Stoic is not the Stoic is not uncontextually a cooperator. They don't default to cooperation without additional context. Or maybe they do default to cooperation, but they don't necessarily cooperate if more context comes up. But they won't betray just for the hope of decreasing their sentence. Like decreasing their sentence is not a good reason for a Stoic to betray.
yeah. Perhaps another way to put it is the Stoic will cooperate, but what that looks like in terms of acting with the other person might be different depending on the circumstances and the context. And
Yeah,
just as you say, they're not going to betray someone for the sake of getting a shorter sentence here.
cool. Um, okay, we've got two more. Do you want to run through these, Caleb? These are yours.
Yeah, so there's another sort of challenge to utilitarianism called the Omelas Child. It's from a short story by Ursula K. Le Guin. Imagine a utopian society where everyone thrives, but their happiness depends on the suffering of a single, permanently tortured child locked away in filth. If the child is freed, the utopia collapses. And the question is, as a member of the society, do you accept this bargain, or are you going to essentially, out of protest, leave Omelas and be one of them, be one of the few who walk away from the utopia that's run on the suffering of this single tortured child?
Mm.
So that's the thought experiment. What are your reactions?
Well, my reaction, I mean, are they always a child? Is it the same child or do we rotate? Um, the child aspect makes it interesting too, because I think Ursula K. Le Guin is trying to maybe make the suffering seem more great. But if it was an adult, maybe we could give that person some sort of role, really put them on an altar of appreciation. Because this seems to be like a factual relationship between utopia and physical suffering. My other reaction is that I think it's interesting that the question isn't should you torture the child. The question is, do you leave? Basically, it seems to me like you're getting external benefit because of somebody's viciousness. And it's like, do you accept that trade off? And I guess the Stoic answer to that needs to be no, right? Like the Stoic answer is not, again, like, I mean, you can think of this in other examples. If somebody had slaves that they treated terribly, if you were friends with someone who was very rich, who made their money through sweatshops, you can change these to more practical examples. The Stoic is not going to, yeah, not going to, I guess, associate with those kind of situations and those kinds of people just for external benefit. And maybe the Epicurean does. I keep blasting them, but maybe people who are just interested in pleasure do. But the Stoic, they don't have a benefit, right? They're not benefiting from this utopia, which is presumably a material utopia, not like an ethical utopia,
Mm-hmm.
because it requires being bad people to sustain. Um, yeah, so my first gut is that they leave. Um, yeah, this is kind of the extreme opposite of the utility monster. It's like instead of one person feeding, you really suffer, you really crush the one person to make the happiness of all. Um, yeah, and I guess my quick answer is that that's going to be no, because that's a pleasure happiness or an external good happiness, and the Stoic isn't. There's no. They're not. That's not a worthwhile choice for them. But that might be a bit too self-sacrificial. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. But I wonder if the case for staying, as it were, is if you look at analogous situations. You have the sweatshop case you just gave. The kinds of defenses people make of those sorts of things is that, look, that's the best option given the alternatives. The alternative to someone working in a sweatshop is them making money by picking up trash in a landfill or something of this sort. And if we don't build a swept shot here, that's what's going to happen. So I suppose if you tie that to the Omelas case, it's your leaving isn't going to make a difference to the outcome. And if this child wasn't tortured, then there would be no utopia. And I think that's perhaps how some Stoics in the past might have justified other kinds of injustices. But I think that's the kind of move someone would make in for justifying, this kind of thing, causing others to suffer for the sake of so putting it and saying some greater good isn't the right Stoic framing. So I think it can't just be that utopia is something you passively enjoy. I think it's got to be something that is valuable, and people who stay there play a good role in creating and sustaining. So it's in that sense, it's got to be something worth promoting. Perhaps like civilization is worth promoting today. And I think that's saying something more than it's just something that makes people feel good, right? It's you have these ideas of justice, courage, and such that are involved in promoting civilization. Perhaps that's the same with utopia. Anyway, that's a little bit of a
Yeah, no, that makes
long
sense.
rant, but
Like it's one thing. Like I'm kind of portraying the utopia as a bunch of hedonistic experience machines, right? But maybe it's the situation where it allows people, you know, leisure time. It allows them to study philosophy. It allows people to build these kind of projects for the greater good. Um, and I guess this is one of those examples that the Stoics lived in, right? And maybe you have, on one hand, your more hardcore Stoics, like an Epictetus, who's like, I'm going to go start a school somewhere else and get out of this Roman Empire. And maybe on the other hand, you have someone like a Seneca who's like, well, yeah, I could walk away from Nero, but like, what good does that do the current situation? Better to, immerse myself in this. There doesn't seem to be any chance of change in Ursula's situation, which is what makes it a bit more of a dilemma. But I guess at that point, you kind of have to be all in or all out, where you either remove yourself or you dedicate yourself to making it the best utopia possible and maximizing the good because of the sacrifice being made. But yeah, like you were on, it's not like the Roman Empire wasn't built on some terrible working conditions, slavery and suffering and all these kinds of things. And Seneca and Marcus Aurelius were in different roles, but at the top of that pyramid. They didn't remove themselves from it.
yeah, absolutely. So I think at the first pass, the Stoic answer would be to walk away. But perhaps especially when you construe the thought experiment as more of a utilitarian one, where utopia is just something you passively enjoy, it's very pleasurable or something like that. But if you think about, I think that some of the challenge, making it a little more thornier, is thinking about, so it's a case of great suffering, but what's created is arguably, in effect, a good, and the people involved are playing good, virtuous roles. Then perhaps at least the best as they can. Then the questions become a little bit more thorny, and I think that's related to some of these practical questions involved today. Involving sweatshops, the way we treat animals and such. So, and I'm not saying one way is right or the other, or making a statement about those kinds of decisions, but I think that's one way to make this thought experiment thornier.
Yeah, a lot of these have a lot in common, right? Like it brings me back to pulling the lever, right? Like you're pulling the lever. I don't know if it's the exact metaphor, but you're pulling the lever straight into this poor kid locked away in filth, and you're making a utopia for other people because of that. Interesting one. Did you want to hit this last one, or do we got to call it for time?
Now we could call it for time. I think that's
Any final takeaways?
let's see. Yeah, in terms of general themes, a question sort of the and thinking about what's morally relevant for Stoics, some of the easier thought experiments involved, cases that maximize pleasure or something of that sort, where the Stoic can say, no, the happiness machine, the experience machine, not that valuable. The utility monster, not a challenge for Stoic ethics. And then I think where you get into some of these trickier situations, the sinking ship, the questions really become, who are you? What are your roles? What does acting virtuous look like here? And those are the kinds of things a Stoic would uh, take seriously, and perhaps, given the nature of these thought experiments, there's not going to be an easy general answer, even though there might be better answers in specific situations.
Yeah, I think that's right. So like there's some cases where there's some pattern recognition, black and white. Okay, if the dilemma is around maximization of pleasure, as you said, not that compelling. But everything else, it's going to be. It's not like you can just be like, oh well, does it involve killing? Because then it's wrong. Oh, does it involve torture? Because then it's wrong. Does it involve? It's not even as simple as. It's not even clear that as a Stoic you should be the one to stay on the boat and sacrifice your life. It's just not these black and white, clear cut answers as you called out. I think the flip side of that though is like they're also not hard and fast on these deontology rules. Like there's going to be some situations where it's okay to kill. There's going to be some situations where it's okay to torture. There's going to be some situations, um, you're pursuing virtue, but virtue is contextual. It's not a kind of a heuristic or law following or rule based. You're going to tend to cooperate, but there's going to be some situations where cooperating in the prisoner's dilemma doesn't make sense. And I think it can be a bit unsatisfying, but ultimately, more robust and nuanced, and life is nuanced. So I prefer it that way, but a bit less of a, not as like clear cut as utilitarianism or at least simplistic deontology can be.
Yeah. I wonder, though, if a different framing is, and perhaps we've sold the view that, there are just some things you actually should not do or some things you actually should do. Perhaps we've sold that view short. I wonder if a different framing is, when you're thinking about these sorts of thought experiments, then the questions become dependent on context. But once you've defined the context clearly enough, you actually can come up with rules, or maybe perhaps even absolute prohibitions for specific people. For most people, you could say you should never torture someone, or you should never be in a situation like the Omelas type situation, or perhaps something like that. Anyway, I think I wonder if there's just some kind of move there, that like once you've defined the roles, who you are and such. I just wouldn't want someone to come away from this conversation and think that there's nothing to this sort of absolute, maybe more black and white views, because of course, famously throughout history, Stoics have had very hardline moral views, whether of course it's Cato the Younger defending the fall of the
Mhm.
Roman Republic, or Stoics, people influenced by Stoicism who wanted to prohibit slavery, even if it did promote the greater good, and they wouldn't listen to people about, it's more of a nuanced type situation, and like sorts of justifications people would give for treating humans differently. So I wonder if I wouldn't want to sell the sort of hardline moral type views
Yeah.
too short.
I mean, I think it's a good pushback, right? Like when you read Epictetus, he's pretty prescriptive. He's not like, oh, well, it depends. He's very prescriptive about you should do this, you shouldn't do this. Someone threatens you to throw you in jail, let them throw you in jail. Um, I think you hit the nail on the head where it's like they just don't do this kind of reasoning of like, you're this like generic floating through space person without a past, and you find yourself in this situation. What do you do? They just didn't really use these examples. I mean,
Yeah,
you said
yeah,
they're prescriptive. It's like, okay, you are a senator and a tyrant threatens you to do something. What do you do? Well, it's very prescriptive then, right? As you brought up about, once you have those rules in place, then it can get really, really prescriptive. I agree. And yeah, it's not relativistic. I would hate to say that. It's not relativistic, it's just context specific. But the context doesn't have to be so specific. It's like, well, we can't even mention it. Even just getting some rules on like, that's your child, that's your brother
mm-hmm.
or sister, that's your parent. Once you get some of that content on the table, you're moving. And a lot of these thought experiments are set up to remove those, which is not really, I guess, how the Stoics did ethics.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's well put. Cool. Well, let us know if you think there's some other moral dilemma we should take on, or if you think we got one of these wrong.
Yeah, that'd be great. I would enjoy to see other people's opinions.
All right, Michael.
Thanks, Caleb.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.